see what all the players testing positive for COVID? We had how many Clemson players?
21 Clemson.
Yeah,
Yep.
and then like 13 more, like almost 35 players or people involved with the football program testing positive for COVID.
Right.
And these are guys that are mostly asymptomatic. So that's the other thing that's kind of the catch-22 about this disease is that it's only going to kill about 20% of the population, and most of the athletes, when they get sick, they don't even know. So they've been testing now because they want to get back to playing. So that's why there's a little more of a spike in some areas. Not the only reason, but that's part of the reason. And a lot of these guys will go asymptomatic, not even know. And the good thing about that is when they're tested, they're not going to infect anybody else, so that way they can stay quarantined. But what do you think, Speedy? Do you think we're going to have a season?
I think there's still plenty of time to have a season, just because I think in terms of college football, it's, for one thing, a little shorter than an NFL season. Obviously, they have a bunch of bowl games, but again, that's one bowl game. It's not like you have to have a series of particular things like other sports, too, with the ones in the playoffs. So I think it'll happen. I think it will be either shortened or, again, modified, I guess, in some way. I think the problem is with college football in comparison to the pro sports, is just there's a lot more teams. So there's going to be more travel. You have to figure out, all right, how are we going to deal with this in terms of dealing with it local? Because college schedules come out, 7 years in advance or something like that?
Yeah.
So it's hard to prepare for anything like that when these schedules came out in 2013 or 2014. Trying to plan for all these rivalry games and stuff like that. So it's definitely trickier.
I know, and these are big deals for some of the smaller colleges who play big name colleges.
Right.
It's their only year to play them, maybe, and make
the money,
some
right.
money. But I think a good idea that I hear keep getting tossed around is to stay conference only. Now, obviously, that would work for SEC, Big Ten. Big 12's a little more spread out, so I don't know how well that would work there.
The ACC, I think, is the most spread out because they got the whole East Coast.
And then you also got Notre Dame. Like, what did they do? You cannot have a college football season without Notre Dame. People would revolt. It'd be fine with me, but I think people would revolt.
Well, we don't get to see them choke in big games.
Yeah, well, not anymore. Yeah. It's funny because growing up, Notre Dame was, when they had Lou Holtz and they won the national championship in '89. I remember they beat West Virginia, and they just embarrassed West Virginia. And I was like such a hard game to watch because I didn't like Notre Dame. And then they've really had a decline here. But I think the thing is that everybody thinks they get a pass because they don't have to worry about playing in a conference. And if they do play in a conference, it's like a mix of the ACC and the Big Ten because they have Michigan, they have Michigan State, and then they have a lot of weak ACC teams, which we see. Clemson. Obviously, Clemson's proven themselves as a powerhouse, but they basically get escorted into the college football playoff every year because they don't have to worry about a powerhouse like the SEC or the Big Ten. There's no other team. Florida State maybe back in the day was, but not anymore.
Miami, the 1 year recently, too, was it 3 years ago, when they were undefeated. They destroyed Notre Dame in their game, and then they were undefeated until they lost to Clemson.
Yeah.
So
but this isn't the Miami of old,
No, I know. I'm saying recently, if you're judging the ACC, it's interesting to look at the trends of outside Clemson, where else has it come from? And you're right, it's really only Florida State early in the decade and Miami the 1 year, and then obviously they ended up choking in that one badly, and they lost their coach after that.
Yeah, I remember one year they laid an egg against Syracuse. And then the next year down in Clemson, they almost lost to Syracuse again. They had to win. I think the backup quarterback.
Right, Chase Bryce, yep.
Yeah. And so that Clemson's going to be a player in this. But for other teams, when still the power conferences, obviously, the SEC, the Big Ten, I think the Big Ten made last year when Ohio State dominated like they did. I think that they didn't win the national championship, losing to Clemson the way they did in the semifinal. I know Ryan and I were talking about this a lot when it happened. Is I felt that the Big Ten, because of how Ohio State dominated, that was their time to win. And if they didn't, that they were still going to hear the echoes of, Big Ten, it's nowhere near the SEC. They're an also-ran. Every time they get their big chance, they wind up losing. And I think last year, clearly Ohio State was, if not, it was always, are they better than Alabama? Well, last year they were because Alabama wound up losing to LSU. Then they wound up losing a heartbreaker to Auburn. But as even in the Big Ten, there were a lot of good teams in the Big Ten last year. Yeah, Penn State was good. Wisconsin was good.
Minnesota was good for a while, too.
Minnesota was good. They were undefeated for most of the year. So I think that the way they handled that conference gave the Big Ten confidence that they were going to come out and beat anybody. And Clemson was like the team that hadn't been tested all year. They kind of had a soft schedule. Here comes big Ohio State. You got to win that game to prove yourself and to prove your conference as kind of being the best of the best if you're still second class to the SEC. And they didn't.
Right. And again, like you were saying with the scheduling, if that does end up happening, that'll definitely benefit a team like Clemson to be number one. They already have a loaded team as it is, a great recruiting class, like number 3 in the country this year in terms of the recruiting class they got. And again, it also shows how good of a coach Dabo Swinney is. Because remember, Clemson last year, they were not as talented as Ohio State was either. But again, a new coach against Dabo Swinney, they had the coaching advantage there too. So he's going to have a lot of work cut out for him if they do end up restricting it to a conference schedule. Now, again, they have to make sure they don't have those like down games like they did against Syracuse, like they did last year against North Carolina when they only won by 1 because Carolina missed the 2-point conversion. So you can't have those down games in a year like that where if the SEC powerhouse, whoever that may be, is undefeated too and plays obviously the stronger competition. Now, I don't know if we'll have that kind of case with a team like an LSU last year, a dominance level of that much, but it's going to be interesting to see because Florida's a big favorite this year. Obviously, Alabama's always a big favorite, and Georgia's still around. They didn't lose much from last year, so we'll have to see where they go. And they have a big, Jamie Newman, who's their quarterback prospect. Big prospect this year that could definitely make a difference for them as well. So you're right. In terms of the scheduling, it has to be that way for Clemson. They can't have those down games in order to make that happen. And again, if they have all these players struggling with COVID, that could be hard if they lose depth. Obviously, college rosters are bigger, but still. If they're big name players, I'm not sure if there were any big name players listed. I didn't see the whole report if there was any big ones that came into effect. But if they have 21 players, there's a lot of players on a football team.
Yeah, and it doesn't even have to be anybody big because it's going to affect everybody. Because then how does a team get started? See, that's what's going to be so interesting about this whole dynamic of playing with COVID is if somebody gets sick in baseball and basketball and hockey, somebody big, it's going to look at it like this was tainted. Like the championship was tainted. The only other year I could compare to this, in baseball at least, is 81 when they had 2 half seasons. And
that was the one where the Reds were leading and should have been in the playoffs or something like that.
The funny thing was that the two teams who had the most wins in the National League, the Reds in the West and the Cardinals in the East, both didn't make the playoffs. Because they played consistently throughout the whole year.
So what was the reasoning for that? Did they specify?
Not really. It was kind of like there was so much time taken off in between. They wound up coming back with the All-Star game August 9th, and I believe the last game they played before that was in June. So there was almost like a month and a half off, and they figured they didn't want to just pick up because of the imbalance of the schedule, so why don't we just create 2 different schedules? And that was really the first division series, which they would later come on to adopt anyway.
Right.
And I remember I was, 7 years old back when that happened, so I remember watching that and being how different it was. The Yankees wind up playing the Brewers in the first round, and the Brewers the next year wind up
in the World Series
to the Cardinals. And the A's with Billy Martin, who were god-awful in 1979, lost like 100-something games, with a pitching staff of Mike Norris, Brian Kehoe, Steve Langford, all these guys that Billy Martin just ran into the ground and pitched like 200 innings.
Sounds like him.
And they really pitched well. And then Henderson and guys like not Corny Lansford, he was with the Red Sox, but Dwayne Murphy, Tony Armas, those guys, I think 24 guys, led the American League in home runs.
I think Tony Armas was one of them. Yeah.
Like Bobby Grich was another, Dwight Evans was another.
Yeah, Dwight Evans was.
So, that was the closest thing we can compare to the 60 games for baseball. I think is going to be a hard sell as far as a legit champion, but we got to take what we can get.
Now, in terms of the baseball, what do you think is going to happen in terms of how the players are going to embrace it? Again, you think strategy is going to change a lot? Because, again, it's interesting with, obviously, a game shifting to micromanaging as it is. Do you think there'll be more of it, less of it because of these new roster rules and stuff?
It's hard to say. I mean, did you see MLB Network did a show on Dennis Eckersley?
Okay.
And they talked about his role and how he became a closer. And that's really when the game changed. Is this micromanaging? I remember it was Gene Nelson in the 7th, Rick Honeycutt in the 8th, or a combination of both, and then Eckersley gets the ball in the 9th. Before that, guys, your closer came in, and it could come in the 7th inning, 8th inning. So this micromanaging really started with Tony La Russa. Pretty much thinks he just started, baseball as it is. Him and Bobby Valentine.
He also pioneered the pitcher hitting 8th.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Luis Ordaz and those guys on the Cardinals back then. So I think that what we've seen so far is drastic overmanaging. I know with the Mets last year, you got to the point where after the 7th inning, you would fall asleep with all the different moves they were making. None of them really worked out anyway. The Mets had a disastrous bullpen for how many years?
Right. It seems like every big name reliever just dies with the Mets, and it's like that way with a lot of teams. But it seems like it's always with the Mets.
Yeah, but
it's not like they don't try. It's just for whatever reason they don't manage it right.
You know as well as I do that relievers from year to year are hit and miss.
Right. They're very phasey. Besides, I think Craig Kimbrell, Aroldis Chapman, and maybe Kenley Jansen, there's no consistent closers. And even before that, it was Rivera, it was Hoffman, and then before he came to the Mets, it was K-Rod.
Oh my God, gonna start K-Rod. I mean, we're getting into Mel Rojas territory, or Benitez wasn't that bad.
Yeah, well, yeah, you get the point. It's all a phasey type thing. But now I think with the openers, with this more of this micromanaging thing, I think the pure closer element is also phasing out too, to an extent. And I think you're going to see it more as a whole phase out because of this micromanaging. And then they do this thing about the position players pitching too. Like, did that really have to be limited? Yeah. That was funny in itself as well.
I think though, like I heard John Smoltz talking about it, that they're going to go with they could go with 4-man rotations because these guys aren't going to go that many, starters aren't going to go that many innings to begin with. Maybe 5-6 innings. And then by the time we get into September, October, maybe we'll see the big name starters go deeper into games because they're going to need to with some of those teams. With Washington, you saw how Washington used
starters out of the
last year.
bullpen.
Yeah, I mean, that's the only reason why they won because their bullpen was one of the worst in the National League last year.
Right. And I think, who was it, the Cubs that really started that when Joe Madden was doing that with a lot of those relievers. And again, eventually it was caught on. The Red Sox did it when they won, obviously, with side stealing. But
the Mets did it too. I remember Syndergaard coming in the 7th inning of that game, Game 5 against the Dodgers.
Right. Yeah. So you're definitely seeing that versatility come into effect. I wonder, though, too, how much pitchers or managers are really going to do that, though, being that these guys are also, it could be rusty, they could be out of baseball shape, not playing for so long either. So that is the only thing that concerns me a little bit with what you were saying with the 4-man rotation. So I don't know how much it's going to work, I guess maybe short term for the time being. And again, how long term can you really think because it's only a 60-game season?
Exactly.
So
with the number of roster spots available, and I think thank God that they are making these numbers available because these guys are not going to be ready, and especially pitchers, there's going to be injuries galore when we first start. So having those players available, I think, is the right move to make because if not, then what would you be seeing? I mean, we've already seen a spike. I did an article a couple months ago. I talked to Mark Simon, who works.
You've told me about him.
He
many
does
times,
research, and he and I were talking about the spike, how offensive numbers rise and fall, and why there's always a reason for it. Going back to the 20s and then the 90s, and now in the last couple of years, there's been another explosion of runs, and I think a lot of that has to do with also the way bullpens are used. I mean, a lot of teams that win come back against your bullpens because these guys aren't good enough to be starters and they're not good enough to be closers. So the middle relievers, to me, it never made sense how at the most important time of the game, these guys get a lot of the innings.
Isn't that seem surprising though, considering that it's a micromanaging league? They try to pitch for the matchup specifically with left-handers.
But that's it. It's like these guys don't have enough stuff to go beyond one batter, one inning. So if a guy can throw 98 miles an hour, he can face that one batter. If a lefty has a wicked slider, he could face that one batter. But if you give them an inning, they're going to be exposed. And I think now that they have to face 3 batters, the 3-batter minimum, that's going to be really interesting because hopefully that will prevent some of this overmanaging.